One of the most common epithets applied to Azerbaijan since the restoration of its independence in 1991 is a bridge between Europe and Asia. It's especially frequent in discussions of energy, logistics, and transit over the past decades. Yet, while the economic functions of such a bridge are relatively clear, a different question remains. How does this position affect the country itself, its self-perception, and the lives of its people? Salam alaikum, this is Fien. Today we're talking about life in between, about how a borderland frontier position shapes the perception of a country and the everyday reality of its society, about the pros and cons of the frontier, without romanticizing it, but also without oversimplification. Gettik. When assigning a country to Europe or Asia, several criteria are usually taken into account. The classical schoolbook boundary between Europe and Asia runs along the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, the Caspian Sea, and the Greater Caucasus range. During the Soviet period, attempts were made to shift this boundary further north toward the Kumamanich Depression, justifying it with a religious argument that the peoples of the Caucasus are predominantly Muslim and therefore cannot be considered European. This logic may have been acceptable in the 18th century, during the time of Philipp Johann von Stauffenberg, who proposed the Ural line as a continental boundary. But it is entirely untenable for the mid-20th century, especially within an officially atheist USSR. Today, several interpretations of the boundary coexist. According to the most widespread version, accepted in international practice since the 19th century and used by the UN, around 50% of modern Azerbaijan's territory formally lies in Europe. As a result, Azerbaijan can reasonably be described as a transcontinental country. Even its capital Baku is transcontinental. Its historic center and seafront lie in Asia, while its northwestern suburbs already fall within Europe. By cultural and historical criteria, Azerbaijan is more often associated with Asia, a Turkic linguistic group, an Islamic tradition, and close ties to Persian and Turkic worlds. Among the Turkic ruling dynasties of the region, and especially the Safavid dynasty, with which Azerbaijanis on both sides of the Araz River identify, the ruling elite spoke a language which is now called Azerbaijani, while legitimizing its power through appeals to Persian cultural heritage. This compromise, a Turkic ethnic core, combined with an Iranian civilizational framework, largely shaped the subsequent development of the region, including modern Iran, where among ayatollahs and presidents there have been and still are ethnic Azerbaijanis. Even during the period of Russian administration, Europe reached Azerbaijan indirectly and fragmentarily through imperial and later Soviet models, rather than through direct interaction. In the years of independence, daily social engagement with Europe has remained limited. In political and economic terms, Azerbaijan participates in European institutions, exports energy resources to the EU, and hosts the European cultural and sporting events. Yet, it doesn't declare a course towards full European integration. The economy is oriented simultaneously toward Europe, Turkey, the post-Soviet space, and Asia. Therefore, despite close ties with the EU, it's difficult to describe Azerbaijan as a European country. What ultimately matters is not geographical classification, but self-perception. Azerbaijanis have historically understood themselves as a borderland society. It's precisely this frontier position that explains many of the contradictions within Azerbaijani identity. Life at the intersection of civilizations, religions, and political blocs has fostered flexibility and adaptability. Frequent shifts in cultural dominance have reduced levels of dogmatism and radicalism. Hence, the early secularization, the relatively moderate attitude toward religion, and a pragmatic approach to foreign policy. A telling example is the granting of voting rights to women in the early 20th century, although at the same time conservative attitudes toward the role of women in society can still be encountered today. Another example is the generally positive attitude toward Israel in the early 21st century, something unthinkable for many Muslim societies. At the same time, the frontier implies vulnerability. Frontier states often become arenas of proxy confrontation and partially lose control over their own agendas. The Karabakh conflict, which lasted for several decades, is a clear illustration. Throughout this period, sudden moves were impossible. The country had to constantly please everyone in order not to pay the price for any imbalance. The prolonged Karabakh conflict shaped by the influence of external actors, forced Azerbaijan to invest heavily in armament. As a result of persistent threats and conflicts, security took precedence over reforms, the state came to dominate society, institutions developed more slowly, and modernization proceeded from the top down rather than from below. This is a typical frontier societies. Another consequence is a blurred identity. When institutions are weak, society requires a unifying idea. Previously, such an idea was the restoration of territorial integrity. Today, this role could potentially be assumed by the ambition to become a new regional power. Otherwise, internal disputes over who we are emerge, visible even in debates over the name of the language. Along cultural and religious lines, these contradictions are more pronounced than along geopolitical ones. Constant external pressure makes neutrality extremely difficult. In Azerbaijan's case, this is especially evident due to its proximity to Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Azerbaijani identity is multi-layered. A Turkic language, Shiite Islam with a strong secular component, by the way, we have a video about it, Soviet legacies of education and governance, and economic orientation toward the West. This is not a coherent synthesis, but rather the coexistence of different cultural regimes. Such a model helps avoid extremes, yet it also generates a sense of incompleteness and constant comparison with others. This duality is also evident in everyday life. Outwardly liberal behavior coexists with internal constraints maintained by social norms through family, social environment, reputation, and when necessary, state mechanisms. Azerbaijan is not merely a territory between Europe and Asia. It's a crossroads of norms, codes, and expectations, a space of permanent balance. And the frontier is not a sentence, but a condition. Without a strategy, it turns into a source of vulnerability and dependence. With a clear vision, it becomes a resource for flexibility, resilience, and political maneuvering. Borderline states either remain arenas where others play, or they themselves become players who skillfully use their position in between. And what do you think? Is life on borderland a blessing or a curse? Subscribe, like, hit the bell, leave comments, and share this video with friends. By the way, this video is also available in Russian. And remember, there is no good or bad culture. There is simply a different culture. Salamat kalın.